Yeah, okay, even though we are not that many people for this debate, I think we have to start it. And we have a very interesting program. So as soon as the people outside hear that we have actually started, maybe they would come running towards. On behalf of the Danish Helsinki Committee for Human Rights, it is my great pleasure to bid you all a very warm welcome to this debate on challenges and potentials in international cooperation with young people of Ukraine. For this occasion, we have managed to put together a very fascinating panel comprised by a mix of international professionals and both Danish and Ukrainian students. When I'm done with my introduction, I will give the floor to Mr. Badse, who is a highly regarded human rights expert and who was recently inducted within the Helsinki Committee's advisory board. He shall initially provide a legal and political framework for the debate, and he will also present a few arguments as to why it is, from a human rights perspective, so critically important that we continue to strengthen the bilateral cooperation between Ukrainian and Danish youth. Having heard from Mr. Badse, we will proceed with the debate, and I shall present the rest of the panel then. However, allow me to just very briefly set the scene. Before the invasion earlier this year, Ukraine had been an important partner in the Danish Eastern Neighborhood Program for years. Not only was it clear that Ukraine was struggling, among other things, with endemic corruption in government institutions, but certainly also in local communities and educational institutions as well. It was also obvious, however, that Ukraine's industry, agriculture, and educational and cultural spirit held a great potential for also enriching Danish and other EU member states' societies and cultures. Especially the Ukrainian youth has been viewed as an asset when it comes to realizing this mutual benefit. As such, there was a lot of discussion about Ukraine's potential EU association also before the war, and a lot of energy and money went into establishing NGO projects and partnerships, as well as building and enforcing diplomatic and cultural relations. Accordingly, working to establish collaborations between Ukrainians and Danes, young people in particular, has been a central strategic indicator for the Danish Helsinki Committee international engagement in the past half a decade or so. In these projects, raising human rights awareness and building democratic capacity among Danish and Ukrainian youth has been central. This means that not only have the central themes of the activities being related to human rights and democracy, it has also been a constant aspiration to keep the projects within a democratic format. That means that in all of the engagements, it has been important to not just offer human rights education in a scholastic sense, but instead to facilitate roundtable discussions and workshops proposed, arranged and conducted by the young participants themselves. This we have found to be particularly given. But what has happened since February 24, 2022? What future are we looking into when it comes to continuing with the youth exchange programs and civil society bridge building? Obviously, Ukraine is and will most likely remain for some time a very fragile context. Thus, it is practically challenging to raise funds and to set up face-to-face encounters, etc. Yet, the Ukrainian youth has, on a very general level, showcased in the most honorable and courageous way a very strong democratic inclination and an eager to stand up for their rights in order to protect their possibility to determine their own future. So perhaps the current situation, however terrible and bloody it is, presents young activists of Europe with a unique window of opportunity for building a better future for Ukraine and not the least for Europe. these are, in very brief terms, the lines of thought that motivates this debate. And it is now my great pleasure to pass the mic over to our keynote speaker of today, Mr. Badse. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Asbjørn. And now the music also started, so we have the merry background on a very, you could say, a grim situation in Ukraine. My experience also has, for 2 decades, been on monitoring human rights, and I will take my outset in speaking a bit about monitoring human rights and how civil society can assist in that task and help with monitoring on, you could say, on the situation in Ukraine as we speak, the short term, the mid-war, the urgent priorities, and also in the longer run on the, I would say, human rights is not like being implemented overnight. It is something that has to be worked for decades, and there will be setbacks, and there will be better times and positive developments. But it is my experience that we really have to put the long light on, really, to see big changes. But when we look at, and now we'll start with the urgent priorities here, mid-war, and talk about possibilities, potentials, challenges, and come with some concrete suggestions. Afterwards, I will do that also on the post-conflict situation. When we want, and I will also talk about human rights, can be quite an abstract term, so I will try to narrow it a bit down where we could put an effort as a civil society, and also from the Danish perspective. So I think for the urgent priorities here, we need to assist and encourage reporting on human rights challenges which are let's see, exposed due to the war. And we have to focus, as we often do, on vulnerable groups, on refugees, on internally displaced persons, on disabled persons who are not able to move away from the fear of war, and also poverty issues which are related to the war, and children who are especially exposed both to poverty and also being traumatized by acts of war. Another thing where we could have a focus is trafficking of human beings, which are also an issue. We've seen the refugees being exposed when they move away from Ukraine and move to other countries, that there are a risk of and they're exposed to being victims of trafficking. So all these are thematics which can be, let's say, chosen or be prioritized by civil society organizations. Going closer to thematics are, of course, prosecution of war crimes also, which have been discussed, and fair trial principles. When soldiers are indicted or tried by courts, of course, they also have to enjoy the right to a fair trial, which we have seen also in some of the regions, Ukrainian soldiers being tried almost as terrorists, even though they were a member of the armed forces. Not even actually, say, mercenaries or travelers, but people with a British citizenship, but being part of the regular Ukrainian forces there, but being tried as terrorists. So, and of course also risking death penalty, which is of course also a violation of international law. And also just which I not dive much into the report made by Amnesty, but of course we also have, I followed the discussions on that, but at general outset, both Russia and Ukraine must observe the international humanitarian laws, obviously. And of course there's something about when you're a civil society organization or national human rights institution, the impartiality or having an open mind and monitoring violations regardless of who is committing these violations or alleged violations is also important. So, monitoring general violations, data collections, enter into dialogue with institutions in Ukraine, and for example the Ukrainian Commission for Human Rights, focus on social rights in a post-COVID and mid-war situation. The rights of and obligations of military personnel, the status of international displaced persons, and the right to public information, as the truth can be the first victim in a war situation. So the potential is, as Asbjørn also touched upon, a wake-up call for Europe that will draw Ukraine closer to the European values as stipulated in Council of Europe's Human Rights Conventions and the EU Charter of Human Rights. The challenges: it's dangerous, difficult to access sites, the very vulnerable are left behind, and also what you could say, maybe an interesting angle or perspective is also who is responsible for the upholding of human rights obligations within the occupied regions. And since Ukraine has not effective control over this would be kind of a Russian obligation. And what I've read in the university periodic reviews of Ukraine and also after the 2014 is that Ukraine tried to still, for example, pay social benefits in these regions, even though it's under control of Russia, which of course makes sense because it's Ukrainian citizens. But strictly speaking, this would be then the Russian obligations to support and protect people under their effective control. So this is also kind of making it a bit difficult. So concrete situations, approach and support and engage with institutions in Ukraine, approach and engage with civil society organizations in Europe, including Denmark. Consider also looking forward towards civil society organizations in Russia. Are there some counterparts? Here, it's just an open question and it might be too soon, but I'm just airing the idea that there might also be some civil society organization in Russia which could enter into an initial dialogue. Concentrates on vulnerable group, refugees, and children, and people with disabilities. So, I will just also draw attention to the Ukrainian Commissioner for Human Rights and the Kyiv Declaration, which also mentioned supporting, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. This declaration, the Kyiv Declaration, is what a national human rights institution should do in a mid-war situation and in a post-war situation. And in a mid-war situation, there should also be institutions should take measures to identify early signs of increasing conflict, monitor the situation of human rights, documenting and responding to violations, regardless of which party in the conflict committed allegedly violations, and report to international and regional mechanisms. And also where civil society might play a role is promote dialogue between conflicting parties and still while always having particular attention to vulnerable and marginalized groups. So these were what I would say about the mid-war situation. And now I'll move to the post-war situation. And you would say it would be overcoming the consequences of conflict. The possibilities here are Ukraine will move towards Europe. That's what I see. Well, but Ukraine must still work hard to implement human rights obligations in the longer perspective also. When this situation, this invasion somehow will end, remains to be seen how, but there will still be need for living up to European standards and values. Of course, there will still be challenges with the border with Russia, the occupied regions, which I mentioned, the general security situation. There will be instability for a long period of time, and there will be more atrocities that will happen. So reconciliation will also be difficult and hard, and something to be worked on, and the jurisdiction issues for the regions which still exist. So what are the concrete suggestions? Also taking outset in the Kyiv Declaration, address past human rights violations that occurred in the context of the conflict, contribute to fight against impunity, impunity meaning that soldiers, for example, can get away with war crimes, promote transitional justice processes, facilitate access to justice, encourage effective investigations, reparations to build peace and reconciliation, and strengthen social cohesion. So, big words, and I would just, I hope we can touch upon more concretely what could be done, suggestions and proposals. But also in the long run, it is necessary to bring Ukrainian legislation and administrative practice into compliance with EU standards, and to focus on, especially on anti-discrimination, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, etc. There we have a very strong EU legislative framework that has to be implemented. And then, of course, concentrate on supporting institutions and the principles of the rule of law, engage in reporting to regional and international monitoring mechanisms, and focus on exposed groups, LGBTIQ and other minorities. For example, hate crimes could be an issue that could be looked into. And finally, what I could say as just to end my presentations, for civil society organizations in Denmark, I would urge to lobby decision makers both in Denmark and Ukraine, as well as on international level, to provide moral, financial, technical support to civil society organizations and network, as well as to key human rights institutions in Ukraine, and continue to do so, so Ukraine will not be let down in this decisive and fragile time in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Badse, for those inspiring words. I hope that you will remain here on stage to take part in the debate that we're just about to kick off. But let me first introduce the rest of the panel. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Serhii Kostrikov and Dr. Anastasiia Krasnoshchoka here with us today. They were both, among very many other things, activists in the 2014 Euromaidan protests in Kyiv. And as a Danish counterpart to you, we have Sune, Dahlgreen, who has been taking part in international student cooperation projects in Ukraine for Danish and Ukrainian youth. And finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Arnfred, who is the director of the Ukrainian-Danish Youth House in Kyiv, currently involuntarily relocated to Copenhagen. Yeah. But let's begin by simply appreciating the impact that the historic events taking place in Kyiv some 8 years ago seems to have had on Ukraine's civil society. As what seemed to be almost an entire city rising against, or perhaps an entire country, rising against the nation's leadership, and started what has come to be known as the Euromaidan. Anastasiia. please tell us about Maidan. What were you fighting for back then? And what could be so important that you were willing to risk your life for it?
Oh, thank you for having us here. So I guess like every time when talking about Euromaidan, I cannot not mention the first night when on the 30th of November, waking up and then all of the news channel have no comments videos with this extreme cruelty of police beating up students for just speaking up for European values, and just observing that and saying like, okay, I really don't want to live in a country where this is possible. So I guess next day for me and many other young people, older people, it was the urge, the need to say against that and be present in Kyiv. And so the first march of millions happened the next day. So when the students were beaten up, another morning, millions of people stood up and said like, no, we don't want that. And then suddenly, at this moment of time, it became way more than just being about us signing association with the European Union for trade and having European direction, but it became way more. It became more of core values of European Union, about liberty and dignity and respect and being able to say whatever you want, having free speech, media, everything that is supposed to be in a society that has some dignity and rights. Everything that was building up in the country for quite some years suddenly exploded basically overnight. For me, still being like a young student, I was 19 at that point of time, I was interested in politics, but not to the extent that I was above average citizen being somewhere doing a lot of work with that. So it was just from a very simple person opinion and view, this is just not right. So I guess to answer the question, what we were fighting for, to be able to choose the way what I would want, to be able to speak up, to be able to have free speech, free journalism, no corruption, everything that is supposed to be in a country that you are trying to build up, everything that Denmark is privileged in a way to have that as given. So this would be something that completely normal things to have that.
Sure. You said the queue there. In Denmark, we sort of just have our democracy handed over to us, it feels sometimes. Sune has a regular day going to Ukraine on these exchange trips just in the years just following the Euromaidan. How was that?
It was a very overwhelming experience. For me, I read the newspapers also back with Maidan and followed the war also to some extent and took interest in it, but it was still something. And I think for many people it can be maybe not as much now, but since the invasion, but something a bit far, a bit distant. So it was still something. I thought it would be something different for me, people different than me. And going there was very overwhelming to see people just like me, just like oneself, dreaming of living in a democracy, in a modern state with rights and a security for one's own life and the right to define one's own life. Something that we took for granted.
Yeah, sure.
But to meet people that were striving for that, there was some, in one way, very overwhelming and like painful to see people just like you in a very painful state, but in another way also very, very inspiring to feel that spirit really thriving. Yeah, it was a very big experience.
And you were actually not in Kyiv, you were in Kjærsgaard, which is a small city just 75 kilometers southeast of Kyiv. Did they talk about Maidan? Had it reached there?
Yeah. Many of them had friends or relatives who took part in the Maidan, but it was also you felt that it was a big national thing. It was not just like a capital thing, like something going on at the capital with people not taking part in it. And the rest of the country, it was really something everyone spoke of and took part in this spirit.
Okay, yeah, so it seemed that we were well on the way forming these cultural bridges between Denmark and Ukraine before the war. But Serhii, with your experience of the Maidan in the back of your mind, why is it so important that we now maintain and intensify these relations?
I think what is really important for Ukrainians and of course for people who are risking their lives in Maidan is to be also accepted with our strivings to Europe, because of course we understand that there is still a long way to go for Ukraine to reform everything so it actually reaches out to European standards. But what Europe has to also understand about Ukraine is that just some 30 years ago we were a part of a completely different country with an absolutely different ideology which was infringed on people for 80 years, being Soviet Union of course, and the path that Ukraine has gone through during these 30 years is pretty fast, but we still have a lot to do. But what we can do is to reach those goals much faster with the European support. And it's both about practicalities and sharing the best practices, because when you had those 80 years to actually build up a better democratic institutions, to develop a better capitalism here, and to adjust and to find a dialogue between different strata of societies, we didn't have that. But instead we can also work on adopting the strategies and the visions that you already have and see it is working. But what is also not least important is to feel the support, to feel the fact that when we are turning our backs to Russian ways of doing things which entail severe corruption, which entail a firm hierarchical society, and we turn our faces to Europe to feel that it is also something that Europe is willing to accept, and that the people of Ukraine are also welcome as long as we are striving for European values. That's why I think it's important to maintain that, because a part of Russian propaganda is actually very firm on trying to deceive some of the Ukrainians, saying that no, West does not take you seriously, no, you will just be some source of just natural resources to the West or whatever, and we all know it's not true. But it's also important to, every once in a while remind that also with initiatives like Sune was describing and Asbjørn. So that's why I think it's very important.
And Julie, the ideas for the Youth House certainly were all formed in the wake of Maidan, and one may perhaps even say that they grew out of this momentum that Maidan really constituted. But when the ideas were about to be realized, tensions were indeed rising, and Russian forces were mobilizing on the northern and southern borders. But how did you experience all this? And could you perhaps explain to us what happened now to the Maidan momentum in Ukraine?
Oh, well, that's a big question. So of course, not being Ukrainian, I don't know if I have the full solution to that. But yes, the Ukrainian-Danish Youth House was started before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February this year. So we started 1.5 years ago to create a platform for young people to actively participate in society, to be creative, to exercise and exchange their democratic rights. And would have been a perfect platform for the student exchange that Sune was part of. What I was seeing now that I actually encountered personally Ukraine the first time only in 2018, so it's a very brief relationship, where I was an intern at the Danish embassy in Kyiv. And I chose that as a destination because I had no clue about what Ukraine was about. There was no knowledge whatsoever, kind of the same experience I guess Sune had had, that we had not been presented to what Ukraine was, which type of country, which kind of culture, which kind of people. And I kind of like to explore the blind spots, so I went to Ukraine and was really fascinated because there was very, very much to dive into and to learn from. And then I came back with the job with the Ukrainian-Danish Youth House 3 years later. And even there I could see a huge development in the country and in the city and in the young people who are carrying the development. And what I feel is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not the one to kind of own the story, But what I feel is that Maidan kick-started some kind of movement in young people about claiming identity and claiming kind of the engagement in the democratic process. Also what you were mentioning with the free media, that's what you actually want. You want your rights, you want... And this has been a very like... I feel that it's been like a tsunami in the Ukrainian society, that like in 8 years you go from not having much of that to having a lot. And civil society popping up, arts and culture popping up. And I really saw that intensifying. And of course, it like being invaded in 2014 pushes that dimension even further, of course, because now you have an actual threat to your national identity and to the values you defend. So I really see this like movement being very strong, and I was actually saying, like last summer I was back to give reports about how I thought it was going in Ukraine, and I was saying that it was going very quickly in the good direction, because that's what I was seeing. In very short times there was like this complete turnover, and all the young people who engaged are not from the old system, right? That's also what you're saying. It's only been 31 years just last week of independence. This week. Oh, a lot of stuff happening, yes. So it's only been 31 years, and I think, like, and that means that, you know, you guys were born in a free Ukraine, as opposed to the system that's old. And that, like, this change also is really important to take into consideration. So I really, like, I feel that if it hadn't been for the full-scale invasion, and maybe also that's part of the reason why it actually happened in the end, is that Ukraine was very quickly trying to kind of align with the neighbor EU countries, right? In terms of rights and reforms and anti-corruption initiatives, stuff that normally takes a lot of time, it does, but still, a very rapid development.
Yeah, and I certainly get why you don't want to take ownership of that entire narrative, so maybe we can pass over the question to one of the Ukrainians. Well, I mean, given the fact that that we now have a full-scale invasion and we have a lot of practical issues and we certainly have a lot of terrible stuff going on, in what sense, if at all, does that impede this struggle for a more democratic future for young Ukrainians?
No, in many ways, I think, first of all, and first and foremost, in the practical ways, it has some, it impedes international communication, and you know, people have their lives disrupted in general. Some have losses in their families, and this all can be classified as personal trauma and practical impediments. But at the same time, it also forces people to distance themselves further from Russia, of course. And it happens to be that Russia represents a corrupt state, as I discussed, and that means that every one of Ukrainians who chooses the battle, being that on the actual military front, or just doing volunteering, or just staying where they are and carrying on their job, they also think additionally, like, why do I stand this fight? And everyone decides that, yes, I stand this fight because I want a different country. I want a country which is like the Western country. And that's why I think it also boosts this additional level of comprehension, which was already boosted a lot by Euromaidan, because when people were going outside on the streets, everyone was accepting the risk of being arrested or killed or tortured, because that is the price of change when you find yourself in this dire situation, and you cannot do it otherwise. And a little bit of a similar feelings people have also now, like an additional boost of that. Why do we standing up? Because we want a different country, we want an independent country. And I think also one of the reasons why people are so strong in their standing up is because they feel, you could say, an ownership over the country they started creating in 2014. Because that's where we've gotten a glimpse that the change is possible and we're actually moving in the right direction. And now, all of a sudden, someone wants to take it away from us. So in that sense, I think in a moral sense, it actually boosts a lot of emotional response, but of course creates practical impediments.
Sure. So there are practical impediments and there are morale boosts, and they are sort of competing to see who will be the stronger one in this sort of war. But then the logical next step for this discussion would be to simply throw out a question to all of you. about what areas then are the most pressing areas to focus on. If we were to, re-kickstart these youth exchange programs with not necessarily exchange in the Erasmus sense, but having sort of venues where young Ukrainians and young Danish people can exchange their ideas about the future and their ideas about nation building and etc. What areas are the most critical ones?
If I may, of course, a lot of work has to be done within different directions. I myself, being an artist, believe that there's a huge power to arts, and a lot of messages can be communicated through art. So investing in this kind of work would be, I think, really beneficial. Also, some things you can communicate with art is not something you can learn the numbers and then just implement it and write a report. It's something that touches you deeper. And especially I feel like in this point of time where it's so highly emotional, the situation what is happening, so ugly but also so beautiful with the spirit what is happening. Tapping into the cultural and artistic part, I think, would be really beneficial and also strengthening a lot of other initiatives. But of course, as well, I believe what you're doing with all the democratic work, all the democratic summits and festivals and exchange programs, that would be fantastic. I think Serhii might add on about the initiative for the refugees being here, might possibly taking part in the observation of the Danish elections happening, seeing how democracy in action is working, and seeing, okay, all of this is working, not only on the numbers, not only being told that it's working, but it's actually working, seeing it with your own hands. Sorry. Yeah.
Sure, was she leading over to you?
Yeah. So I think, as Anastasiia just pointed out, it's nice because, on one hand there are these practical impediments, but on the other hand there is a fraction of people who are temporarily displaced right now, and many of those people are actually also activists. So introducing them to how the governmental system works here, when they can see it, like in case of upcoming elections, how it works with a practical experience, is really important. But together with, of course, one of the main manifestations of democracy being elections, there could be other aspects of democratic society where you simply can train people in while they are anyway here. So that's sort of something we can use to our benefit at the moment. So that's, I think, one of the solutions.
If I may add, I think also a whole basic human thing is actually the platform for meeting each other, like one-on-one in a dialogue, which to me is the core, let's say, ingredient in a living democracy, that we can meet, we can make a platform where young people have a space or a sphere where you can meet and discuss and exchange, because it's also about relations. And again, in 2018, I think I knew one Ukrainian, and just meeting that first person was oh wow, we're kind of the same, okay, that kind of expands my view of Europe, I've had that feeling very many times. I was extremely ignorant before. But, just this kind of actually personal relations where you can actually meet on an even basis and discuss. And that often comes through projects, where you meet, but are should not be disregarded how powerful they are.
Yeah. And if I can
Sune and then Kristoffer.
That was the exact same experience that I and many others had. That it was, of course, we had the framework of human rights and cultural diversity and stuff, workshops and activities, but it was all, and they of course were meaningful, but it was also just the meeting and hanging out together and I'm not a professional in this context, just like a normal person meeting other people, and for young people, I think that's for everyone, it's very, very important, and it was so meaningful. It made sense and it worked, and it was just an eye-opening experience, that exchanging ideas, talking together and sharing ideas, that's really a powerful tool. And I think sharing these experiences, different experiences, is one of the maybe softer aspects of the work, but it's a really important one for human rights in general.
Yeah.
Speaking about human rights, I think something that could frame a dialogue and discussion among young people is I have experienced in much of my work is it would boil it down to very often to a test of necessity. When you want to, you have absolute rights, absolute human rights, prohibition against slavery, the prohibition against torture, etc. But many rights are also a bit flexible. And what it says in the convention is, if it's necessary, democratic society, you can limit, for example, freedom of speech, you have to protect against hate speech. But it is what is necessary in a democratic society. Is, I think, a very sound effect. Now in Denmark, we talk about the banning of headscarves in schools. Is it necessary in a democratic society? It's kind of the test in many of these questions, human rights questions, and there's of course criteria of proportionality and the rule of law and legitimate aim also, but necessary in a democratic society kind of rings a bell for me, at least, every time I want to kind of find my human rights compass and see where can, new legislation, new initiatives, is it necessary in a democratic society to limit this? And if it does not stand the test, well, we go back to the main rule, which is freedom for the individual. And that's kind of a difference between an authoritarian regime and a democratic society.
Yeah, okay, so we have established the fact that we may indeed witness like an increased momentum just right now, on the one hand, while on the other hand we have established the fact that it is very difficult to actually carry out projects in Ukraine. So it seems as if we're caught up in a paradox here. Now is the time to act, but now is also a very difficult time in which to act. So how do we continue from here? I know this is not a question that I'm not looking for a concrete answer, I'm looking for reflections here. But how are we to take advantage of this momentum when it is this, difficult?
I think a pretty obvious answer, something that probably many thought of, is of course to maintain simple online meetings and maybe make it into a structure, just the way you would make offline meeting, but just with the online meeting, with the ability to share, because there could be some problems with getting at least half of the Ukrainian population out sometimes, being males at the moment who are not let out of the country. In that sense, that's why I think it might be beneficial to try and develop a framework of online meetings for that matter, and I think it will be welcomed a lot.
But what does that mean to the regular Ukrainian to know that this possibility exists? To talk with people from Denmark, for instance.
I think that it's difficult to speak from an average Ukrainian, but
sure.
Definitely people who are interested in some international activism, which are nonetheless very, very many Ukrainians. It's useful to know that there are people who are both ready to share the experience, there are people ready to bounce ideas, because sometimes, in Ukraine, people are brave with new ideas, and yet people, especially in the current situation, may have very little room for practicing or trying it out. And that's why I think it's important to have that opportunity. And I think when you have a group of people, you can then decide from there which topics are of the foremost interest at this moment, and which are the needs, which are the resources, knowledge-wise.
And also, if I may add, also coming back to the fact of being listened to and knowing that you are still supported, that West is interested in whatever struggle you're going through. So coming back to that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, that's kind of my job, to try to find out how to engage Ukrainians and Danes together. And we have to, of course, do quite some things, especially with exchange online. You can do stuff like offline in Ukraine, but then it's hard to bring the Danes because they're not really allowed to enter. But online, we actually do see really a lot of interest. People do sign up for lectures, for meetings, for debate groups that we facilitate. So there is, like you're saying, absolutely a huge interest. And then there's and that goes specifically for the men who cannot leave. So then, of course, we have to include them in the conversation because, of course, if you target the ones only outside the country, it's mainly women who could travel out. And it's important that we keep an eye on both groups, let's say. But when that's being said, also what Anastasiia was saying before, the Ukrainians who are outside of Ukraine right now, involve them, and like you said, like there is exchange, there is learning, and they can come here and see how stuff is going. We've also actually invited Ukrainians to participate in different of the democratic and like festivals and youth festivals here in Denmark, and that's also a point of exchange if they are able to travel. But I would say that if anybody is involved in civil society, reach out to the Ukrainian counterpart and facilitate stuff online because Ukrainians are incredibly eager to hear, and I'm very amazed because I'm like, how can you have the capacity to even think about these things in this moment? But they do, because there is such a strong interest in moving forward and getting out of the war and kind of recreating a better country. So really like the platforms, like whether you're in a student organization or an art organization, you can always find like someone to exchange with and establish a network.
Sure, thank you so much. I mean, just maybe to wrap this up, Christopher, I mean, the Helsinki Committee is a human rights organization, and all of these interesting ideas that has been out on the table today, they are, so to speak, they are about human rights, but in a very broad sense of the term. How do you see an alignment with what has been talked about today and sort of the more concrete human rights needs that you presented us with at the beginning of this?
Thank you, Asbjørn. I think it's so important what was mentioned here around the table, where you have interaction among youth in Ukraine and Denmark, and they inspire each other, and they also learn from each other. And it's also, I think it's important also not that everything is perfect in Denmark and everything should be exported to Ukraine, because we have a lot of issues here as well. Sometimes we are also kind of too traditionally in our views and have this long history, so we are a little bit stuck with what we have, and that limits our imaginations for new or better solutions. So that's also been my experience, that it's kind of a good practice experience from both countries to a better, more democratic and human rights oriented society. So I think this dialogue, and I completely agree, it has to be something that, the arts, the freedom of speech, the digital, the Sune agenda, all these things that kind of, the monitoring of issues could be on an application for the cell phone, mobile phone, thinking a bit out of the box, new tech solutions could also be interesting. But having this ongoing dialogue is extremely important, and I think also have some, you would say, personal lighthouse. I participated, and I know also some here around the table participated in this organization called Humanity in Action, and we visited a lot of interesting people, a lot of, I would say, charisma, and something role models, basically, role models, which you can relate to as a young professional, a young person, and say, okay, this is a democratic European with the heart on the right place, and this is something I want to kind of mirror myself in. So I think that's important, and be exposed to very interesting persons within journalism, within culture, with all kind of, so it doesn't have to be legalistic or only art. It has to be kind of a mixed, a diverse approach to embrace the European values.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christopher. I mean, we have been allowed an extra 5 to 10 minutes because we started a bit late. So I just wanted to know if either one of you who's stuck here, who's sticking with us through the entire thing, do you have questions for the panel? I know that they are very eager to take questions and they give very interesting answers, as you have already seen, so please.
Hello, my name is Ellen. I'm a nurse here in Denmark, and I had no idea there were such things in Ukraine. So I was sort of blank when I came. Didn't know you were working between countries for young people. Didn't know you didn't have democracy like we have for centuries. So this is completely new for me. Very inspiring, and I'm very, very glad so many young people are working this way as you're doing, and I hope all the best for you. But the very most important thing is who's winning the war. Will you be able to work with this after maybe next year? And I hope for you really that you will.
Thank you so much for coming, I have to say. Wow,
Yeah,
that's what dialogue can do. That's amazing.
sure. Yeah, but what about the war? Who's winning it, and what happens after it? What's your appreciation of this?
Okay, so, I will have to play military expert here if the question was about the military situation, but if you look at that, there are many signs of the fact that the Russian advancement is stalled. So basically, during last 2 months, there were little to no on-land advancement by the Russian military forces. So there was almost no new territory occupied. And you can see that also by their fake statements that their Minister of the Defense, or more like Minister of Offense, Shoigu, said recently that, they are doing it on purpose, which is not true with Russia, because they said that they will be in Kyiv in 3 days after the start of invasion. So those are the signs of that, and of course Ukraine, while still lacking proper quantities of the Western weapons to launch full-blown liberation of the occupied territories, there are still some things happening where Ukrainians, by using very precise weapons like HIMARS, for example, are able to disrupt the supplies of weapons to the occupied territories, to Russian army, and have been destroying many Russian ammunition storages. So it seems like there is ongoing preparation for the liberation of the south, and as you can imagine from the military perspective, to go for the offense you have to have much more resources, and a more specific one like tanks, for example, offensive type of weapons than for the defense. So in some way we can see that at this moment Russia cannot advance much, but Ukraine cannot yet go full-blown on the liberation of the territories. But I think, as someone commented on Twitter, analyzing Russian military power, that when you first state that you will be in their capital in 3 days, and in half a year they're displaying your burned tanks in that capital, you're probably not the superpower you would thought you were. So in that sense, we are in this moment of still, I guess, waiting for a little more weapons support, but at the same time with a full readiness to launch the liberation. And importantly, again, Russia cannot advance further. Furthermore, they are claiming that they want some talks, which I don't know which talks can be. Get out of our country and then we can talk, whatever. And then they also trying, how do we call, so they try to appear as if everything goes on purpose.
Yeah, sure. And this is not a question, but you have something to add?
Yeah, just to add, because the question was also when the war is over, what happens, to say in Ukraine, not if, but when we win the war. So that will be the moment where, with all the acknowledgement of whatever was lost and all the trauma and dramas that happened in our territory, so much eagerness and will to actually build from the scratch many things that were not working properly, but then with knowledge of how much price we paid, of course paying back to all of the fighters and actually establishing the country that was worth fighting for, So.
Sure. And just to add perhaps a final remark here, regardless of how many people of the Russian, nation who are claiming to support or actually do support the war actions in Ukraine, there will come a time after the war. I know, Christopher, you also touched upon this briefly, where we will have to think about re-establishing connections between Russia and Denmark and between Ukraine and Russia. And I know this I'm not saying this to offend Ukrainians at all. I'm just saying this, this can be years out in the future. We are not ready for it yet, but there will come a time when we need to think about that, just like we did after World War II. Wars end somehow. And right now, we just have to figure out how we can help Ukraine. After that, we need to talk about how we can re-establish connections. Not only diplomatic connections, but also people-to-people relations with Russian people as well. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking part in this. Yeah.